So, if I could ask you to introduce yourself and then we can jump right in.
Sure thing. So my name is Jen Glinski, and at the moment I am a research associate at the University of Glasgow in Scotland, where I specialize in researching economic abuse. I did my PhD at the University of Glasgow. I just wrapped that up, and the PhD specifically focused on economic abuse in Scotland with female victim survivors of domestic and economic abuse, and sort of the identification of economic abuse of the survivors, but also what they do to seek support, how they seek support, and then what support's actually available in Scotland right now. So that's kind of my research. Off the back of that, I have developed a resource. It's the post-separation economic abuse wheel, which is available. Along my day job of being a research associate, I also run my own consultancy where I specialize in economic abuse, where I train professionals. I provide strategic advice and policy advice, as well as research to anyone in Scotland who's interested in tackling economic abuse and learning more about it.
Fantastic. So, that sets us up very well for the first question is, would you mind defining exactly what economic abuse is?
Yeah, of course. So, economic abuse is a form of domestic abuse. At the moment, we don't have a universal definition. It's actually a form of abuse that is just now gaining a lot of interest and traction in research, even though we've known for quite some time that it exists. So, although we don't have a universal definition of it at the moment, there is a definition that comes from academia, which is very commonly used. And it's a definition that was developed by Adrienne Adams and her colleagues in 2008. And that's the behaviors that control a woman's ability to acquire, use, and maintain economic resources, and thereby threatening her economic security and potential for self-sufficiency. So that's a bit of a mouthful. So if you don't mind, I'll just break that down really quickly. One, you can, from that definition, see that it has been gendered. The majority of the research into economic abuse has been done with female victim survivors, but that's not to say that it doesn't happen to male victim survivors or non-binary victim survivors as well. It's just part of that definition. And the other big thing to point out within that definition is the word economic resources and economic abuse. So oftentimes economic abuse gets interchangeably used with financial abuse, but they're not one and the same. And that goes back to that part of the economic resources. So it's that ability to use or acquire and maintain your economic resources. So things like your housing, your car, your employment. It's not just about money. And that's one of the biggest misperceptions about economic abuse is that it's someone controlling or restricting your access to money. That's part of it, but it's not the full picture. So us in research that work in this field, we really try to hone in on that definition and that word economic abuse, because we want people to realize that it's not just about your money, but it's about your economic resources, everything that you need to survive and thrive in your daily life. So economic abuse happens. It depends on where you are in the world of how it's being applied. But here in the UK, in Scotland specifically, we apply it to partners and ex-partners. And it comes from, intimate partner violence, which happens between a partner and an ex-partner, as opposed to familial abuse. So in Scotland, the economic abuse wouldn't occur between two family members. It would have to be your partner or your ex-partner. And it's when this partner or your ex-partner restricts, sabotages, and exploits your economic resources. So this can be anything from refusing you access to your own bank account, taking your income off of you, and spending it in ways that is not profitable or beneficial to you or to the family if you have one. Also taking out large sums of money, taking out coerced debt. That's one of the big things is coerced debt. So it's someone taking out loans, credit cards, anything in your name and building up debt in your name with or without your knowledge, which you are then responsible for paying off. But it's not, like I said, not just about money. It can be interfering with your employment as well. It can be stripping you of your housing or putting their names on the deeds or on property titles, so that you might be liable for all the payments of your apartment or of your house, but the other person actually owns it. So when it comes to separating, that can be quite tricky. The big thing to note as well, sorry, I'm giving a really long
It's great.
explanation of what it is, but there's so many different factors to it. The big thing to note as well is that it doesn't happen in isolation. So it happens with other forms of abuse, such as emotional abuse, physical abuse, and psychological abuse as well. So oftentimes people will ask me, well, this person cleared out my bank account and I've never seen them again. That's not what we're talking about. It's really about power and control and how finances and other resources, how you can get that power and control over that person and over their life. So it's not a one and done clearing out your savings account and never seeing this person again, or sort of, a different form of fraud. It's really controlling the resources that this person has. And what it does is it strips you of all your economic resources, including your money. And it means that you then become dependent on the perpetrator, which makes it all the more difficult for someone to leave. So this is what we're seeing happening across the globe, actually, now that we have sort of this working definition. And when I start to tell people, this is what it is, they go, oh my goodness, I know exactly what you're talking about, because it's very prevalent, or it's happened to me, or it's happened to another family member.
So, can I just go back to one point that you had made? You mentioned interfering with business or
Mhm.
interfering with your work. What does
Yeah.
that look like? Like in
So
practice?
yeah, what commonly happens is, so not business as such, but interfering with your ability to stay in your employment or seek employment, or it could be education as well, depending on where you are, in your life stages. So what we commonly see, and we've known this for many, many years, but now it's just been, sort of repackaged as economic abuse, as it were, is that, for example, the perpetrator, your partner or your ex-partner, will stop you from going into work. This can happen by, causing, for example, bruises that you are not able to cover up, so that if you had to go into the office, for example, or do what we're doing right now, after a post-COVID world, sitting online where these bruises might be visible, where it could ask, an employer might ask questions, or a colleague might ask questions. It could also be when you're at work interfering with it. So, I have my mobile phone quite close by. At my desk, I tend to have my mobile phone quite close by, but you could see messages coming in, or the phone ringing like every 30 seconds, every minute you get a message in, so that you're actually not physically able to work, and that you're a bit on edge. Because like I said, it's not just about financials, it's about other forms of abuse as well. So this coercion and this control and that intimidation and fear is always there. So it means that depending on where you are in the world and how, forgiving or how involved your employer might be, it might lead to a disciplinary action, because maybe you're turning up late all the time. Maybe the perpetrator is hiding your bus pass or hiding your car keys, which means you're not able to get to work, or you're not getting to work on time. Oftentimes, this comes with then needing to do a favor or needing to give in to some sort of coercive demand from the perpetrator in order to get your car keys, or in order to get your bus pass to then go into work. So what it does is it makes you, especially if you are responsible for all the payments of bills and everything, if you know you cannot provide and not cover that because your employment's being interfered with, you can imagine like the mental and the psychological toll that that will then take on someone, and what you'd be willing to do to assure that you can get into work on time. So there's a variety of different tactics that perpetrators do use to interfere with your employment. For example, in my research, quite a few women lost their employment because it was simply too stressful to go in. Their employers were perhaps not very supportive. They might not disclose the abuse, so an employer might not actually know what's going on. They just see an employee not performing, being late, very unfocused, and to the point where maybe they just feel like they're not performing in the way that they should. And instead of having that very difficult conversation with someone and saying, is there something else going on I need to be aware of? They will let the employee go. But it depends on where you are in the world and employment law. So it's not always that straightforward.
So that's interesting that you've presented this kind of spectrum of things where it's not like what you would imagine the most obvious form of it being, like we're physically restraining someone from going to work, but it can also just be hounding them with calls and texts and just interfering in their day and making their life so much more difficult.
Absolutely. And even things as small as, some of the women that I interviewed were reliant on medication, had diabetes, for example, or wore glasses. And the perpetrator would hide their glasses so that they couldn't, physically see, depending on, your level of visibility, and wouldn't be able to work. So, how do you tell your boss, like, oh, I couldn't find my glasses for the 10th time, So it's really, really small, sort of insidious forms and tactics that are tailored around the victim survivor. So whatever it is you that makes you you, a perpetrator will purposely target that. So it could be glasses, it could be your medication. And in one example, actually, I had a woman who's sorry, I'm making it gendered because my research was done with female victim survivors. But I had one woman whose partner every night would, in the UK, we've got little switches on the walls that, takes down the electricity or turns off the electricity, and she would plug her phone in every night. And every morning she would wake up and it wouldn't be charged because he would go and just turn the switch off. So, and that's where you see like gaslighting as well. So, I mean, everything is on my phone, all my numbers, I don't know anyone's phone number anymore. But just even not having that available to you, every morning she would wake up and go, I know I've plugged this in. I know I put it on charge. Why is it not charged? But I have no battery. So, how am I going to deal with dropping the kids off at school or checking my work email? So it's really, really interesting little forms like that. But you're absolutely right. The big thing that we still think about when we hear domestic abuse or domestic violence is physical. It's physical and sexual. And, we look for maybe an employee or a colleague that has bruising, but perpetrators are very clever. The bruising now won't necessarily appear in your face where it's visible. It could be along your arms, and you see your colleague always wearing a cardigan, even though it's roasting in the office or something. It's done very, very cleverly, and it doesn't necessarily have to be physical to create that intimidation and that fear.
Are there any specific elements of the way that economic abuse manifests that you tend to see more in smaller communities? Maybe
Yeah,
like communities with strong religious or historical ties?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, as I said at the beginning, we are still at the beginning of our economic abuse research. So it's not, I know 2008 sounds like a long time ago, but in terms of research, it's actually not that long. So we need huge amounts of research into different types of communities. I can speak to my own research here that I did in Scotland, where I did go into smaller, more rural, or even remote locations, such as the Highlands and Islands in Scotland, where you have smaller communities that are very far away from the mainland and from services. So what I did see there were a few things. And again, this is just my research. I can't speak for what else might be out there if we do have different community research. But what I did see was that oftentimes in smaller communities, for example, there's usually one employer or there's one big employer. So in Scotland and in the different places I went to, that tended to be like the local council, the local government. And it would be the case that the perpetrator and the victim survivor were both employed by the same employer. And that creates a huge amount of difficulties. So you can imagine being in the same workplace, you have that feeling of being monitored all the time because your partner's right there, your ex-partner's right there. It also means that, if, for example, your partner's more liked or more well liked than you are, is, very gregarious and very lovely and charming in the workplace, but at home is a very different person, you can see that you would really struggle to disclose that abuse and seek support because everyone else, all your other colleagues really like this person and wouldn't possibly see that they might be capable of this. They might also go, back to that interfering with your work. They might also be able to interfere with your work schedule. So if they know someone, or heaven forbid, even if they're your boss in some form, in some capacity, they could really interfere with your income in that way. So having a common employer was more common in smaller areas and smaller communities. There's also the everyone knows everyone effect. I know it's a little bit of a stereotype as well, but in smaller communities, what my research showed anyway is that it is very much a thing. And if you pair that with money still being an incredibly taboo topic, no one wants to talk about it. So you have very tight-knit communities where, the perpetrator might go unchallenged or unchecked because the victim survivor simply does not want to disclose it because everybody knows your mom, knows your aunt, and the embarrassment that still comes with, having experienced abuse, unfortunately, and seeking support is very real, especially in more tight-knit communities. Something as well, you asked about religious communities. I don't have any data around religion specifically, but what I did find in some places in the west coast of Scotland, it's definitely more traditional. It's kind of more in a heteronormative traditional sense where the man is the head of the household, and that's not really to be challenged. And it goes as far as saying that like men are just in charge of the budget, and that's just the way things are. So if you were to say, well, I don't I have to beg for money. Even though I have a really good income, I need to beg him for money. I don't have enough to survive. He's constantly dipping into my savings. It might just be seen as that is his right as your husband or as your partner, which is again something that's very traditional and that we need to challenge. So it's uncommon, again, that in a situation such as that you would disclose the abuse or that you would be looking to, inform other people that this is happening because it's just, well, that's just the way it is. And, he's allowed to be in charge of the finances, which is a very gendered way of looking at households and incomes. And the other thing, and then I'll stop, I'll stop there. But the other thing as well, in terms of economic abuse, specifically in smaller communities, I did see more perpetrators borrowing from community members. Or running up tabs, with like local bars or in local shops where, that's Jerry. He's good for the money. They have a little running list of things that he's come in and gotten or borrowed or done, usually like in a pub as well. And then when the victim survivor tries to separate, what she finds is that all these bills and everything that Jerry's built up is actually in her name. And then local shopkeepers and everything will come around and say, well, we can't find Jerry. So you're responsible for repaying this. And that's something that, again, if you don't have the money, if you didn't have access to your own money, that of course then becomes a serious problem because you cannot repay it. And all of a sudden, the nice friendly shopkeeper who was happy to put it on Jerry's tab is now knocking at your door and demanding repayment. So those are sort of the things that I saw in my research. But like I said, we're at the beginning of this research and we need so much more into different communities, different styles, and different vulnerabilities as well in terms of intersectional experiences of economic abuse.
So it's really interesting that you touched on some of these themes. So this year's Guam Human Rights Initiative conference, the theme is poverty.
Mhm.
So what would you say is the relationship between economic abuse and poverty? Is it self-reinforcing? Is it kind of cyclical?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And we always try to be careful with domestic abuse research in general. There's been this long-held perception that women from lower socioeconomic backgrounds experience higher rates of abuse. And it's simply not true. Anyone can experience economic abuse, can experience domestic abuse. We do see from the research on economic abuse so far that there are certain vulnerabilities which do make you more vulnerable to experiencing economic abuse, and that's to do with already existing economic inequalities. So this can be, for example, we see it more prevalently with women who have lower pay, who are in insecure employment, or have caring duties or unpaid caring duties as well, where that's a possibility. We also see it within different age groups. So where perhaps you are drawing down on your pension because you're now retired, but it also makes you more vulnerable. So we do try to be very careful about how we talk about poverty and experiences of abuse because we know that anyone can and does experience abuse. But I would say, yes, there are close links between economic abuse and poverty or financial hardship. And that is, as you say, sort of cyclical, because the point of economic abuse is to strip you of your economic resources. The perpetrator wants you to be completely dependent on them to survive, including your housing, including food, including the necessities that you need, toiletries, all these things, like we said, your keys, to make sure that you're able to survive and thrive. So this happens so commonly in relationships where there is domestic abuse. And that stripping of resources is incredibly powerful to the point where, as I said at the beginning, it means that you're oftentimes not able to separate from an abusive partner because you simply do not have the resources to do so. It means that if you have left, you're more likely to return. We know in the UK, for example, the average amount of times a victim survivor tries to leave, to physically separate from their abusive partner is 7. And that is, it comes back down to resources because you cannot survive without those resources. And the perpetrator has made sure that you are either on the poverty line or living in poverty already. So going back to the perpetrator often seems like the safest route. And then what my research showed in particular was post-separation economic abuse is incredibly prevalent. So even if you did manage to leave with some resources, the perpetrator will do their utmost after you have physically separated to really annihilate those resources. So that again, you are left probably near the poverty line, if not in poverty. And that recovery is incredibly difficult. And that comes back down to, if we look at it from a gendered perspective, women do not have an equal standing economically at the moment to similarly situated men. So this means that we encounter several more factors, which means it's that much easier to strip us of our economic resources. The women that I interviewed left with absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. Fled at crisis point. If they had children, some were able to take their children, others were not. And I found it astonishing that even 10, 12, one woman, even 30 years after she had left her partner, was never, ever able to regain that financial independence and security afterwards, because of the continued economic abuse by the perpetrator, but as well as society and systemic issues, which just meant that female poverty is accepted. Sorry, that's a very long-winded answer
No,
to
no.
your question. They are related, and I do find them reinforcing because it is designed to plummet you into poverty.
Mhm. And I think one of the really important elements that you brought up was the whole question of why didn't you just leave? Right?
Mm.
You hear that so often in the narrative of, well, if you understood that you were being abused in some way, why didn't you just walk away? And it's never as clear cut as that.
No. And that was the question that set me on my PhD journey because I felt that women were getting asked that all the time. And I used to volunteer for a domestic abuse charity. And when women came in, they just said, well, I have no money. And what are the options around that? I mean, if you and I walk out our front door today, we're going to need several resources, right? Like I'll need my house keys. If I know I can't get back into my house if I leave, I'm unlikely to step outside the front door. So what we often use is this analogy of, the front door is wide open, but you can't walk out of it because you don't know what's going to happen when you do and if you take that step. So leaving is entirely interdependent on the resources that you have in order to do that. In my research, I looked at if women save, if they're able to save in these circumstances, does it make sense to save? Is it safe to save any money? And oftentimes the perpetrator will interfere with this process as well. And I think one of the most devastating findings that I had from my research was that actually in the UK, or in the Scottish context in particular, savings did not benefit you because then you do not have access to public funds if you have a certain threshold of saving. So women would do their utmost, put themselves and their children in danger to save small amounts of money to get away, and then find, well, that's great, but now you have to pay for all your legal fees because you have X amount of savings. You don't qualify for any social security benefits or housing benefit because you have savings. Oh, and by the way, there's a property in your name, so you definitely don't qualify for anything. So having savings hurt you in the long run. And it's
But
amazing because
but
you're
you're
just
not talking about huge amounts of savings here.
no, oh gosh, no, no, no. I'm talking about like maybe 1,500 pounds.
Yeah.
So not a lot. And if you think about, leaving with nothing but the clothes on your back, which many women tend to do, and then having to rebuild everything from scratch.
Mhm.
I mean, these things are expensive, especially right now. There's a cost of living crisis, but I think Nicola Sharp Jeffs, who used to be the director of Surviving Economic Abuse, she said it best that these women experience, a cost of living crisis every single day because they're trying to make it work. But if you think about leaving your home, having to set up an entirely new home, potentially still paying the bills on the old home because
Mhm.
that's what the perpetrator is making you do. So you don't default, so your credit rating doesn't get absolutely destroyed, as well as setting up an entirely new life. Getting your white goods, getting your kettle, getting your fridge, getting silverware, getting these things back in, all of this costs money. There's no amount of savings that you could have. And then when you do have them, like I said, it means that it immediately disqualifies you from certain forms of support. So that's the devastating aspect. But we're finding more and more that, there was a survey that came out by Women's Aid, which is a domestic abuse charity here in the UK, last year that said, over 50% of women said, I do not have the money or the resources to leave, so I'm going to stay. And if you stay, it means that you're experiencing other forms of abuse for longer. You just go on to experience them. So it's a really, really difficult conundrum about wanting, needing, feeling the need to leave. And like I said, the average amount of times that victim survivors do try to leave is 7. So there's something happening there each time where you just think you have to go back because it's the safest, the most logical thing to do. But we
Mhm.
don't really think about it. We do ask that question over and over again. Well, why doesn't she just leave? If things were so bad, why didn't she just get out? And there's no just getting out, or certainly not doing it easily.
Yeah, especially if there are kids involved and if there's the pressure of a small community, there's so many barriers in the way.
Absolutely. Because, like I said, everyone will know everyone's business, especially in more remote communities. I spoke to support workers as well as victim survivors, and, they were quite upfront. Well, there's a bus that comes every 10 days, and either you're on that bus to get out of here, but then everyone knows, like, oh, what's Jen doing by the bus, by the bus stop, and that will
Mhm.
go like wildfire. And if you're trying to keep yourself physically safe, keep your children physically safe, and I mean, children are an excellent point. You have your own employment to consider if you've managed to, stay in your employment. You have the kids' schools, you have the children's communities. So it really, all those factors are things that people are constantly weighing up and calculating versus, physical safety. And it's oftentimes not until a threshold of worry about your physical safety or your children's physical safety has been crossed that the leaving then becomes absolutely essential.
Mhm. So you've worked with both nonprofits and large financial institutions regarding economic abuse. What advice do you have for organizations looking to either protect their employees or offer support services?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. And I think it's so important because the different places that I've worked have often always thought like one step beyond their
Mhm.
employees. So they've been thinking about their customers or their clients or, the people who are attending their support services, but don't think about the fact that, if 1 in 5 women experience economic abuse, that will be members of your staff as well. And what to do around that. So that's kind of the number that we have at the moment. So it's 1 in 5. And if you look around your office, it means that someone either is or will have experience or will know someone who is currently experiencing economic abuse. So it's not just about your policies and procedures being up to date for your clients or your customers or your service users, but for your own employees as well. So I think what I would always recommend is, obviously broad thinking, you have to have good, specific internal guidelines, policies, and procedures specifically on domestic abuse. It's a topic that many people feel very uncomfortable with. They don't want to, I've heard so many times, I don't want to put my foot in it. I don't want to say the wrong thing, which is very, it's very honorable. It's the right approach to have because you recognize this as a delicate and, very difficult situation for that person, but you need to have these difficult conversations. So I would always recommend that you do your organization and everyone or your company, everyone in it, undertake domestic abuse training. It's no different than any other vulnerability in that, loads of places get training on, aging, on Alzheimer's. For example, I used to work for a bank. What do we do with customers? How do we best support customers who might have dementia and are forgetting important details? And how do we best support them? Or cancer as well, for example. There's a lot of support available for other vulnerabilities, and we need to recognize domestic and economic abuse as one of them. So undertake training, get it to all of your employees, not just frontline staff if that's what you have, a different setup in your company, but every single employee, because domestic abuse is everyone's business. And you don't know if you might be the person who spots it or that could help your colleague, or that could definitely be that lifeline in making recommendations. And then I would also say that it is important for everyone, but I guess in particular HR, whoever will be taking this on in terms of, implementing the policies and procedures, that you are aware of the relevant support organizations. It always surprises me when I do training that people have no idea who the relevant organizations are that you can make a referral to.
Mhm.
So it's really important that you know these, and that the UK is split up into 4 different nations. Who are the relevant support agencies within each nation? So it will do you no good if your customer, your client's sitting in Scotland and you give them, a Northern Irish service to phone. So
Mhm.
having that awareness is really, really important. And then just a few other things, I think it is massively important, and I think people don't quite appreciate this, that work in that workspace, if you're physically going in, is often one of the safest places away from the perpetrator. So I don't think employers appreciate enough how much this space matters and how much breathing space it gives to a victim survivor. So I know we discussed earlier, your phone might be ringing off the hook, you might be getting texts and stuff like that, but you can put it aside. You have that space within your employment. So acknowledging that is very important, because you are providing a safe space to that person. Also, listening. I think this is one thing that goes often by the wayside, because you want to spring into action. You want to do something. You want to help this person, but it's about listening. Victim survivors are the experts in how to keep themselves safe. And you need to be appreciative of that and listen to them and listen to what they say their needs are. So, for example, they might say they need time off in order to relocate, if that's what they're doing, just as an example. Can that be paid time off? Can you have something in your policies that says, if this is the situation and it's the result of domestic abuse, that there is paid leave that allows your employee to relocate, for example, and take that time. The same, I mentioned post-separation economic abuse. Part of one of those forms is to drag the person through court all the time, because it depletes your financial resources if you're having to pay, solicitor fees, court fees, all these other things. So people sometimes need spontaneously, because you just get the court letter through. You oftentimes don't know when the hearing is. Can you do something around that would support them, where they do have paid leave because they're going through a court process? So yeah, policies and procedures, having that safe space, keeping that safe space, knowing the relevant organizations. And when you are working with, or when you are receiving a disclosure from your employee, I'm not sure where exactly it's come from. I've seen different sources, but the 4 R's are the big ones. So recognizing what's happening, that's where your training comes in. As we said, it's not just bruises, it's not just physical. So recognizing the forms of abuse, responding to it. So listening without judgment, being empathetic, having solutions available, reassuring. This is a huge one, because oftentimes we see it in, discourse all the time. I won't be believed. What if I tell someone, but I won't be believed? So reassuring your employee, letting them know that you believe them, validating their experience. And then that fourth, and that really important, are the referring. So that's where knowing your support services come in. Those are some of the basics that I think should be included in every single policy and guideline for a company, or an organization or a charity, whatever it might be, to assist your employees, and to make, maybe establish those pathways, those referral pathways, to relevant support organizations.
So I do love that you made the point about the victims themselves being experts in what they need. I think like with the GHRI, we've done some work in the past around human trafficking, and
Mm,
we've worked with some of the financial institutions. And one thing we found is that people who have gotten out of situations of trafficking often don't have any sort of government ID. They don't have any sort of credit history. They have no identifying documents. So the way that you approach getting them set up with a
mm,
kind of financial foundation is very different than you would to somebody who wasn't experiencing that kind of thing.
yeah.
So that kind of like flexibility and adaptability is really important when dealing with this, and listening to what they have, what they need, and helping them build that foundation is really important.
Absolutely. And we see that the ID thing is a great example because that is a form of economic abuse. So withholding all your documents, especially, I'm in Scotland, my accent's obviously
Mhm.
not Scottish. If my husband were to withhold my passport, my driver's license, any of my qualifications, my degrees, if I literally didn't have access to anything with my name on it, that makes things very, very difficult for me and advocating for myself to try to get support to prove who I am, but also having access to my bank accounts if I have access to my bank accounts. And as I said, like a lot of financial institutions have done really great work with other vulnerabilities. So the ID issue is not just an issue for domestic abuse victim survivors, but for people who are experiencing homelessness as well. They don't have IDs necessarily on them. And they've come up with pathways of support that you can have an alternate piece of identification, or work with you very closely to listen to what has happened, how, we are now in this particular circumstance, and what can be done. But yeah, it's that listening that is so, so important because I think most people's good nature does jump in and they do want to offer, 101 solutions, but it might be really, really simple. And listening to what that person is saying to you is just absolutely crucial. So they might just be like, I need some paid time off. That is all I need, and it will be fine. I know all the relevant services. With economic abuse in particular, they might say, I need to set up a bank account that he does not know about.
Yeah.
I need the secret bank account. Can you put my paychecks into this bank account, please? Or can we do half and half, just so no eyebrows get raised and you can see that income's coming in, but can we do this? Or can I have an advance payment? These sort of things, once you recognize what this is and you're trying to calculate how to safely, if that's what you want to do, exit the situation, being able to communicate that and having that safe space to communicate that is crucial.
Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today. This has been incredibly informative and just incredibly insightful. Thank you so much.
No, of course. No, thank you so much for having me. And yeah, please let me know if there's anything else.
I absolutely will. Uh, yeah, this has been great. Thanks so much. So I will be sharing this with our team. We'll get it all cleaned up and everything like that, and then we'll be posting it on LinkedIn. I'll make sure that you're tagged and everything. We'll send over any sort of materials that we have. And if there's anything that we can provide, please let me know.
No, it'd be great if there's just so people can see it if someone needs it. It'd be great if there was a link to the wheel, the
Yeah,
post-separation economic abuse wheel.
yeah, absolutely.
So employers can see it, or whoever might stumble across. But I can send you the link for that. And it has been translated, but it's yeah, still, but the English version and an accessible version is available. But yeah, I just try to kind of push that just in case someone happens to stumble upon it and just goes, there it is. So that would be awesome.
Did you send me a headshot and a bio by any chance?
That's a great question. May
Because
have,
I know we kind of set this up like a month or two ago. So
yeah, yeah,
if you could just send me a headshot and a bio, that'd be
yeah.
great. Whatever like short bio that you'd like us to use, we
Yeah.
can,
Okay. No,
yeah.
I can do that. Yeah, I'll do that. I'll probably do that on Monday if that's okay.
Yeah, that's perfectly fine. Absolutely. Take the weekend off. And
Run
it's the
around
4th of
the
July in the States anyway, so
Well, there's
yeah.
nothing to celebrate this year, so I'm not sure.
No, but at least the elections were last night and it's not amazing, but it's better,
Yeah, I
I
know.
think,
So no,
here.
that's cute. So when do you need it by though? When I mean, because obviously if you guys clean this up, it'll take a little bit. The
Oh,
headshot.
they'll probably our team will probably start working on early next week.
Okay,
So Monday's perfect.
sure. Okay, sounds great. I can do that.
Great.
Awesome. Well, cool.
All
Thank
right.
you so much. I hope that was useful, and I hope there's some good stuff in there.
Oh,
But otherwise,
absolutely.
let me
Really
know.
fantastic. I was trying to be very sneaky about taking notes, but because on Guam we have villages, and
Okay.
each village has a little mayor's office. So it's usually, like as far as the village goes, it's quite centrally located, it's accessible, it's open every day. I was thinking that it might be a good idea if we put together like a resource document or like something that they could scan with a QR code, but also something that has like all of the relevant phone numbers, some
Yeah.
information, and just kind of pass them out to all of the different mayor's offices anyway, just so that there's something there. Because
Yeah,
not
yeah. I mean, please let me know if you want any help or if there's any resources that I think, definitely include those.
Well, if you have, or if you've come across like tear sheets like that in the past that have the kind of information that you think would be really helpful, if you could just send some over, just
Yeah,
any
yeah.
examples, even just like a picture of one
Yeah,
that
no, I
just,
don't have any pictures, but yeah, no, I mean, there's quite a bit of that going around. Like, I don't know if you've seen like in the toilets here, for example, they always have
yeah,
like
yeah.
that. So, yeah.
I was thinking something along those lines,
Okay.
with some information on it about like what defines economic abuse. Because like your
Yeah.
point about it's not just that one time they clean out your bank account, it's more
Yeah.
systemic than that.
Yeah.
Points like that are going to be really important for it.
Okay. Great. No, 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 I can definitely do that. Cool. All right. No,
Oh,
I'll get
great.
that done. Cool.
Thank
Well,
you
have
so
a good
much,
rest of your
Jen.
day. Yeah, no, of course. And have a great weekend. Okay.
Yeah, you too. Have a good weekend.
Okay. Thanks, Erica. Bye. Bye.